Hi guys, and welcome to this tutorial on Adho Mukha Svanasana, the downward facing dog pose. I'm going to be breaking it down from beginner level all the way through to advanced level, looking at it from a joint by joint perspective. I'm also going to show you different variations depending upon your intention, and we'll be of course looking at some transitions in and out of the pose. Let's go. Let's start in a kneeling position, sitting on your heels. Bring the hands slightly forward, and I want you to first think about your pelvis. Okay, so moving into posterior pelvic tilt, neutral, and anterior pelvic tilt. Okay, moving between those three positions. One thing to be aware of is that you're trying to isolate the pelvis, so as I go into posterior pelvic tilt, I don't want to be rounding the upper back like this. So keeping the upper back more or less neutral. Of course, it's connected, but isolating as much as possible. Okay, so as you go into anterior tilt, not extending the spine fully, so keeping the spine in neutral, and really just trying to isolate through the pelvis. We do that a few times. Now we're going to move our awareness up into the upper back. So let's bring the pelvis into neutral, or even maybe slightly tucked under into posterior tilt. And first think about bringing your upper back into flexion, and then moving your upper back into extension. Okay, extension is just a small movement for most of us. So flexion and extension. We can also add the movement of the shoulder blades. So as we flex, then really spread the shoulder blades apart as you pull the shoulders down towards the hips. And then as you go into extension, you can even think about bringing the shoulder blades together as you pull the shoulders to the hips. So flexion with protraction of the shoulder blades, and then extension with retraction of the shoulder blades. And then let's keep our awareness now on the shoulder blades. So I want you to do a few shoulder circles. So we go forward, protraction, up toward the ears, elevation, shoulder blades together is retraction, and then shoulders toward the hips is depression. So forward, up, back, and down. And let's reverse it. So from depression, shoulders to the hips, bring the shoulder blades together, retraction, shoulder blades to the ears, elevation, shoulder blades apart, protraction, and then depression. So we go back, up, forward, and down. We're going to look now at the arms, external rotation and internal rotation. So I want you to think about the biceps turning up towards the ceiling, external rotation, biceps turning towards the floor, internal rotation. You could also think about the crease of the elbow as it turns up, that's external rotation, crease of the elbow turning down toward the floor, internal rotation. Now we also have the movement of the forearm, okay, but because the hands are stuck to the floor, I want you to think about just keeping grounded through the base of the thumb and the index finger in particular, and creating that external rotation. Sometimes it's even useful about thinking about turning the hands out like this without letting them move to create that torque, which will create external rotation. Let's now apply that in a progression towards the downward dog. Okay, so from this kneeling position, you're going to come out a little bit to more of this puppy position with the knees underneath the hips. Okay, and I want you to think again about pelvis, so anterior tilt, neutral, posterior tilt. But you're going to do that with your chest and head going down toward the floor like this. So anterior tilt, neutral, posterior tilt. Then think about the rib cage. So we can round the upper back, come to neutral, or we can extend the chest toward the floor. So rounding the upper back and extending. Okay, and then I want you to now think about the shoulder blades. So shoulder blades protracting, spreading apart. Now elevating towards the ears, retracting, and then depressing. So forward, up, back, and down. And reverse it. So together, retraction, elevation, protraction, and then depression. We're going to couple that with external rotation and internal rotation. So think about externally rotating the arms and internally rotating the arms. External rotation, internal rotation. Okay, once we've got that, we're going to now try it with the knees lifted off the floor. So we're still in a bent knee downward dog type position. I want you to think first pelvis, a posterior pelvic tilt, neutral, and then anterior pelvic tilt. Come back to neutral, then think about the chest, so rounding the upper back, neutral, and then extending the upper back, chest towards the thighs and toward the floor. And come back to neutral, and now shoulder blades spread apart. Let's add in some external rotation, and then elevate shoulders towards the ears. Then pull the shoulder blades back and down. And just come down for a moment. Probably feeling the thighs burning. In many ways, this is harder than the full position. Okay, let's just quickly stop and talk about different variations for different bodies. Okay, so if somebody has tight shoulders, lacks mobility, range of motion through the shoulders, so is not able to move the scapula, is not able to move the shoulders into external rotation or internal rotation, has no control, the pelvis is tucked under because the hamstrings are tight, shoulders are up around the ears with the shoulders in internal rotation. Okay, so for this person, the pose is looking something like this. Not because they want it to look like that, it's just because they don't have the options to try to create that space. So for them, they need to regress and start in this progression that I've just shown you and get that proper control. And then also start to work on shoulder mobility, hamstring flexibility, which we'll do in another lesson. Okay, but for somebody who has good shoulder mobility, is able to control the scapula, control the shoulder movement, has good hamstring flexibility, then they may want to mix it up, either by pushing the chest toward the floor to open the shoulders and chest more, or rounding the upper back, depending. So this can be a good technique for handstand practice. And then also in some yoga traditions, like in Ashtanga yoga, which comes from the lineage of Krishnamacharya and Patabi Joyce, they often were seen photographed doing the posture with a rounded spine, looking towards the belly button, the spine in flexion, something like this. Whereas the Iyengar way was much longer. Iyengar also used to take his head to the floor to really, because he had such open shoulders, open chest. But over the years, this all changed, and the technique taught was that we had to keep the body in a neutral position like this. And I get it. If somebody's got tight shoulders and they're spending the whole day with their shoulders up around the ears like this, then probably you don't want them in their yoga practice doing the same thing. But if that's not the case, you have good shoulder mobility and you have the movement options, then there are other ways to do it. Okay, so let's continue the progression. So we were here. If you can, then lifting the heels up, but keeping the legs straight, and then see if you can isolate the pelvis, posterior tilt, neutral, anterior. Come back to neutral, and then think about upper back, rounding, upper back, extending chest toward the floor, and then also your shoulders, so protracting with external rotation, elevate, retract, and depress. One more thing I want to point out is that protraction and external rotation almost end up looking like the same thing. They couple together, they work together, and then retraction and internal rotation almost looks like the same thing. I'll show you what I mean. I can protract or I can externally rotate. They end up looking the same. And then I can do the opposite. I can retract or I can internally rotate. And they end up more or less looking the same. The way that I would progress it and the way that I recommend is to first start with protraction and external rotation, go into elevation. Then if that feels good, you can start to move the chest toward the floor. And once you start moving the chest toward the floor, this will naturally bring the shoulder blades into retraction and the shoulders into internal rotation. So if I'm here, protraction with external rotation, elevation, and then if I start to take my chest and head toward the floor, then naturally the shoulder blades will start to come toward each other and it starts to look more like internal rotation. One more point is if you're trying to get your heels toward the floor, this requires a lot of ankle mobility, which I'll address in another tutorial. But for now, you can think about if you keep your shoulder blades pulled down, it's much harder, let's say, to get the heels to the floor. If I elevate, it makes it easier. Okay, I'll show you what I mean. So if I'm here, shoulder blades depressed or pulling towards my shoulders, compared to if I elevate shoulders to the ears, then I can get my heels down toward the floor. Okay, so just to reiterate those points, start with protraction, external rotation, go to elevation. Then from there, you can choose to either stay in a neutral position or you can look towards the belly button with a posterior pelvic tilt. So this becomes like a handstand alignment, especially if I take one leg back like this, round the upper back, so I'm hollowing the chest, armpits open, posterior pelvic tilt. This becomes great handstand alignment technique. Can also be a yoga technique if you want to look towards the navel. Or you can use your downward dog to open your shoulders by pressing your chest and your head toward the floor. But you only would do that if you don't experience any pain. One last thing is the transition from upward facing dog to downward dog. We can either come back and flip the feet like this, which will make it easier to get the heels down, or some people like to drag their feet forward to get the heels down, or you can roll back, accept where you are and don't worry about getting the heels down. So you have a long dog. A long dog is a good dog, but if you want, you can walk the feet in, finding that place that's just right. If it's too close, it doesn't really feel like a downward dog anymore. Okay, so you have to find that right spot where you still need to work towards getting your heels down towards the floor. I hope you found this tutorial useful. If you liked it, hit the subscribe button, share it with your friends, and leave a comment below.